Today, I will be talking about and contributing to what seems like it was a very lively discussion on the panel that I was originally signed to be on. Reconsidering Neo-Bohemia, Persistence, Politics, and Moving Past an Ecological Model of Neighborhood Reputation. This is from my dissertation research, which is a study of 3 neighborhoods in Chicago, of merchants, talking to them about how they deal with their neighborhood's reputation, and the consequential decision making that comes as a result of what other people think about where their neighborhoods are. So just very briefly to give a little bit of background, the big question I'm going to be asking today is, why do reputations outlast their descriptive utility? And what does that mean for the future of Main Street? So the case is Wicker Park, which I believe has been talked about a little bit today. For those of you who don't know, who aren't from Chicago, Wicker Park is a neighborhood on the northwest side of Chicago. It was notable because it was one of the neighborhoods that survived the Chicago fire and actually provided a lot of the lumber and supplies to help rebuild the city. It's historically been a site of first location for large numbers of immigrant groups. Historically, in the 19th century, Poles and Germans. In the early 20th century, Mexicans and Puerto Ricans. What it's become famous for, though, in recent years, specifically the last 20 or 30, is for being an artist colony or a hipster colony. Sociologists have written about this. Mimi Shippers wrote a book about Wicker Park in the 90s. Richard Lloyd, who did his dissertation here, wrote his dissertation about Wicker Park in the 90s. And it became famous because it's where Liz Phair wrote Exile in Guyville. Guyville is Wicker Park. High Fidelity, the movie, is based in Wicker Park. The book was in London. And an early season of Real World was in Wicker Park. So it became sort of a hipster neighborhood par excellence, which is, you continue to see in lists like this one. This is, it came in number 4 on America's Best Hipster Neighborhoods. And this is from Forbes magazine. And if Forbes magazine says a place is hip, then God knows that a place is hip. Yeah, I think it, yeah, or that it's all over, right. Yeah, this is the Vice magazine for the Brooks Brothers set. But this is from recent years. The issue is, so like all the reputation comes from what happened in the 90s and people telling stories about, you know, seeing the guy from Ministry at a record store or seeing Big Black play a show at the Double Door. Both of those places are closed now. But it's different. And I want to talk about why. So. We go to Richard Lloyd, who wrote one of the books about Wicker Park, and he says, I became convinced that these changes, how Wicker Park became a hip neighborhood, could not be accounted for only by examining the activities of local participants, either artists or entrepreneurial capitalists. And so he lays out his own theory, which I'm going to talk about in a second. What this presentation is, and what this paper is about, it's in the tradition of Michael Burawoy, who's a sociologist, and is called for revisits. He famously did his dissertation at University of Chicago at the same factory that he claims he accidentally discovered down in Harvey that Donald Roy had done a book on, 40 years earlier. And he finds different dynamics. And a revisit is particularly theoretically generative because you can see the same place with some of the same actors potentially and see how things have changed. So that's what I'm doing in Wicker Park. Richard Lloyd was there in the early 90s to early 2000s. I started going there about 20 years after that, in the early part of this decade. So just to give a little bit of context for what Lloyd says about Wicker Park, for people that haven't read the book, he says that, that Wicker Park, he documents how it became this cool neighborhood. And I got there, and I sort of expected that's what people would be talking about. But what I found instead was a whole lot of anxiety from people about how the neighborhood wasn't cool anymore. That they're terrified that it used to be cool and it's not. So this is Eric, who's a boutique owner, who's a boutique owner I talked in Wicker Park. And he says, I feel like this is a zoo because people come to the neighborhood to see it being something. And it's like outsiders coming to see this cool neighborhood. And I feel like it's not really as cool as it actually could be. When it's coming as an outsider to see what's happening, and only a few people actually create stuff, Put more succinctly, Jessica Hopper, who's a local record critic, put out a memoir of her time in Wicker Park over the last 20 years, earlier this year. It's called, and in the part before the memoir starts, in Night Moves, she says, "Wicker Park's level of disgusting has ratcheted skyward since this was first written, so use your imagination." So the situation here is you have a neighborhood that's reputation for hipness has persisted, despite the fact that the people that live there would say that the things that made it hip in the first place are no longer true. I'm going to go over what Richard Lloyd suggested made it hip in the first place, and then explain how that can't account for the persistence of this reputation. So again, the methods, I'm happy to talk about this in the Q&A, ethnographic revisit, in-depth interviews. Target population was owners and managers along Milwaukee Avenue, so it's really a 1 mile long stretch between Division and North Avenue. 29 interviews sampled for range within the population. Used Mario Small's case study method from how many cases do I need. So what I want to suggest is that Richard Lloyd proposes a Hegelian model of hipness. By that I mean he proposes these big sort of world revolutionary forces that oppose each other and shows how they confront each other and resolve their contradiction. So thesis, antithesis, synthesis. So he traces this history of bohemianism that moves throughout American history, like the world spirit, and then post-Fordist capitalism, and they come together and come up, and these two opposing forces come together with the hipsters in Wicker Park. So basically hipsters who are willing to work bad jobs because they want to stick it to the man, and having a 401k is too straight, allows for capitalism to work, but also for bohemianism to work. So like Marx, I want to suggest that instead of going to heaven to earth, we need to go from earth to heaven, or in this case, from Milwaukee Avenue to heaven. There's Hegel. He's saying I like them better when they were underground. So what I'm going to suggest is that this kind of thinking, while finding its roots deep in German idealism, finds its roots more specifically, sociologically, in an ecological model of urbanism. It's really a shame until about a year ago, maybe, there was a picture of Robert Park right there. And if it was still there, he would be glaring at me as I say bad things about urban ecology. So urban ecology, this is the definition from Ben Merriman, relies upon two basic assumptions. Economic activity is spatially concentrated, and transportation costs, including time, have a significant effect on the value of land. At some greater or lesser distance from this local production, these costs act as a force, arranging urban populations into zones of people with similar wealth and comparable professional roles. So you see this most famous, this is Ernest Burgess, and this is the concentric zones model, which is sort of the symbol of the ecological model of urbanism. A glance at the model that Lloyd proposes reveals an affinity with this process and with the Chicago School transposed onto a 1990s landscape. So very briefly, macroeconomic processes make themselves felt across physical space as the neighborhood is shaped by the demands of capital and the shifts in the market. Lloyd adds a cultural ecological component to description as these large market forces synthesize the subcultural commitments of 1990s hipsters. So basically, while this is the ecological model, I suggest that Lloyd is proposing an ecological model in skinny jeans. Ultimately, this is a story about how large economic forces interact with ideology on the ground, with not much going on at the meso level. Lloyd's analysis hinges on two components and an implication. The first component is that large economic forces, in this case the restructuring of the dominant modes of production in the capitalist economy, are the primary movers in urban space, shaping neighborhoods and delimiting options for individuals. The second component is that ideologies on the ground, in this case an ethos of bohemianism among 1990s hipsters, interact with the large economic forces by activating commitments that are electively affinitive, to borrow from Weber, with the dominant mode of production. As a result, the places to understand social processes in this model is in the large economic forces and in the small ideological commitments. The implication is that forces in between these macro and micro units of analysis are not as important, which goes back to the quote I showed at the beginning, whereas the actions of individuals doesn't really matter as much. This is reflected in the fact that Lloyd says very little about the impact of local politicians, the goals of local organizations, or the coordination of local businesses, all of which have been demonstrated to have significant effects on urban space, as demonstrated famously by Logan and Malich. This would contrast with a random model where businesses sort of go about their business without direction from or toward anything other than their own interests. So here you see these are all things that you find in great numbers in Wicker Park: hair salons, bars, furniture stores, and boutiques. And a random model, or sort of like a rationalist action model, would be they're pursuing their own ends. The ecological model, on the other hand, says it's coordinated. Everything's directed by the needs of capital, Traditionally, in the Chicago model, it's capital from the central business district, but it doesn't necessarily have to have that geographical component. So while this does a good job of explaining how Wicker Park became hip, it doesn't explain how it persists, despite the fact that circumstances that led to its hipness have disappeared, the fact that artists can't afford to live there anymore, the fact that chain stores have replaced mom and pops. This is an article from The Reader a couple years ago, The Migration of the Hipster of Chicago History, 1898 to present. It's really good, and it traces it basically from Tower Town down to Hyde Park, up to Lincoln Park, over to Wicker Park, and then you see the question marks, whether it's in Logan Square or Avondale or Bridgeport or Humboldt Park. And so what I'm going to do here is explain persistence. That's what I was able to see on the ground. So what is missing from Lloyd's model that needs to be brought back in? One is politics, right? And the other is people. So one thing to consider is that Wicker Park didn't develop by accident. Wicker Park is a politically connected place when it developed. People from Chicago might know who this is. This is Dan Rostenkowski. He was the chair of the House Ways and Means Commission of the United States Congress. More importantly for Chicago politics, he was the Wicker Park committeeman of the Democratic Party. So, the third or fourth most powerful member of Congress happened to come from Wicker Park during the exact time period when money and development was coming into the neighborhood. For those of you who don't know who he is but have suspicions about stereotypes about Chicago, you won't be surprised to find out that he got arrested, an Illinois Democrat who will become the most prominent lawmaker ever to go to prison for official corruption. Studs Terkel was right. Chicago is not the most corrupt American city. It is the most theatrically corrupt. But the other issue beyond political power is reputation management. That, again, everybody sort of, that the hipness in Wicker Park is what drove it to become this successful neighborhood. And you see it, so I mentioned High Fidelity and Exile in Guyville. City on the Make is by Nelson Algren, who lived and drank a lot in Wicker Park in the early part of the 20th century. And all of these things are utilized as part of a narrative about Wicker Park to sell it to people. And everybody's aware of the fact that that's the reason people are coming to Wicker Park. So one of the things that I found was that reputation is a coordinating mechanism. Here's another thing, reputation management for hipness. Wicker Park, even the rats wear skinny jeans and drink PBR. And then there's anxiety about it. So this is a question on Yelp. What was Wicker Park like before it went all Lincoln Park? Which is funny because if you go back to this, you see that Lincoln Park used to be the hipster neighborhood. So you can think of a lifestyle of hipness and squareness. But what you end up having is coordination by the business owners. And it's seen most clearly in something called a special service area. This is called a business improvement district in other cities. It's basically a tax allocation that if you own property in a certain street, you put in a little bit of money, not very much individually, but it goes into a big pot. And at least last time I checked, the Wicker Park Bucktown SSA 33 gets over $1 million a year, and they get to spend it on however they really want to spend it on. And in Wicker Park, they've done it on things like orange bicycle racks and music festivals, but also snow removal and trash removal and things that the government did back when the government did things before the 1970s and 80s. So you can read it. They hired a master planner. They hired some urban planners to make a master plan, and they say the plan set out to lay bold ideas that would reinvent the streets, sidewalks, and open spaces of Wicker Park Bucktown to meet the artistic creativity, hip business culture, and forward-thinking residents of the community. They recognize what makes it. So the growing popularity of the neighborhood, which ironically was in large part spurred by the hip, unique grit and culture the artists cultivated and fostered, is pushing artists elsewhere due to the rising rents and a higher cost of living. So I interviewed one of the urban planners who worked on the master plan, and she told me that during the putting together of it, there were people who weren't necessarily invested personally in Wicker Park being a particularly hip place full of artists and musicians. They owned chain stores, and the people who were their customers didn't really care about that. But that they recognized that the neighborhood became what it was because of this, and that was worth saving because of that. Not because of any personal cultural commitments, but because it's a purely economic decision, and it's something they were able to coordinate around. So again, see, as the example illustrates, Wicker Park Bucktown SSA 33 has led a systematic effort to implement the ambitious 2009 master plan. Throughout, the key has been to collaborate and coordinate. And this is what I want to bring in, is the coordination model. So before, this was capital, largely from the city. What I want to suggest, instead of capital coordinating it, what this model allows is for the different actors with different perspectives, different values, different customer bases, to coordinate around something, to coordinate around a mental category. And it could be an institution, but in this case, it's not. It's a reputation. So going back to the question, why your reputations outlast their descriptive utility, and what does that mean for the future of Main Street? Another way of saying this is, why does reputation remain when conditions that made it possible disappear? Thanks. One of the answers to this is cognitive capacity. This is good old Georg Simmel. He wrote in his seminal piece, The Metropolis and Mental Life, that one of the things you see in cities is the blasé attitude, which is the idea that you're walking down the street and you see people and they sort of have, no look on their face, and they're just like walking forward and not thinking about the world. And the reason he says that happens isn't because people are rude, but because it's a basic necessity of psychological well-being in the city. That there's so much sensory information coming at you at any given time that it's impossible to take it all in. He says that if you tried to take it all in, you would be like an exposed nerve. Basically, that if we tried to take in everything that was happening in the city, we would have a nervous breakdown. And that's one of the things that fuels reputation. Reputation, and reputation complete into stereotypes, one way to think of it is that, it's a heuristic that we use, that we can't have complete information about a place, so we have to use shortcuts. And if we might know really detailed information about stuff that's very important to us, we might, know our spouse's birthday, or our children's school schedule, or, what kind of chips they stock at the local corner store that we really like. But for other types of things that aren't as important to us, like what a neighborhood that's far away that we go to sometimes is like, we use shortcuts. And so because of that, there are people that are able to take advantage of the fact that they know people use shortcuts, and they're able to coordinate around that. And that's what these business owners do, that even though these business owners don't necessarily believe in the truth of Wicker Park being a hip neighborhood, they realize that it's something they can sell with not a whole lot of effort, because reputations, once they're in place, are what Gary Fine calls sticky. So the implications for this, for what we're talking about today, is in addition to examining what's actually happening on the ground, we have to take seriously what people think is happening. Wicker Park has lived off its reputation for being hip, despite the fact that that reputation outliving its descriptive utility, which is positive if you're thinking about the vitality of Main Street, that a neighborhood doesn't have to be cool, people just have to think it's cool. There's a negative flip side, though, which is that a dangerous neighborhood that becomes safe doesn't suddenly lose its reputation for danger. And when designing policy, I suggest it's not enough to make plans for substantive changes, we also have to plan to change reputations. And that's it. Thank you.